The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Emma stepped into the cozy little cafe on the corner of the street. It was her favorite spot, small, warm, and always buzzing with life. The chatter of people enjoying their morning coffee mixed with the sound of the barista calling out orders. It was just another ordinary day, or so she thought. As she stood in line, scrolling through her phone, she noticed an elderly man in front of her. He wore a tattered brown coat, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket to pull out some coins. The barista waited patiently as he counted, his fingers fumbling as he tried to make sense of the change. Emma could see the hesitation in his eyes. He didn't have enough. A lump formed in her throat. She had been in tough situations before, struggling to make ends meet as a college student. But she had always believed that kindness didn't have to be grand to make a difference. Before the man could say anything, Emma took a step forward. "I got it," she said with a warm smile, handing her card to the barista. The old man turned to look at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "Oh dear, you don't have to. It's just a coffee," she said gently. "Enjoy your morning." For a moment, he simply stared at her, as if trying to understand why a stranger would do something for him. Then, his lips quivered into a smile. "Thank you," he whispered. Emma shrugged. "No big deal." The old man took his cup of coffee, nodding in gratitude before walking toward a small table in the corner. Emma paid for her own coffee and went on with her day, thinking nothing of it. But she had no idea that this small act of kindness was about to change everything. The day carried on as usual for Emma. After finishing her coffee, she rushed to her part-time job at the bookstore, helping customers find their next great read while balancing her college assignments. Life was busy but predictable. She had learned to juggle everything: her classes, her work, and the occasional night out with friends. Though she didn't think much about the old man she had helped that morning, a small part of her wondered if he had been struggling for a while. He had looked frail, his clothes slightly worn, as if they had been used for years. But she didn't want to assume. Maybe he was just going through a rough patch, the way she had a year ago when she had to take on extra shifts to pay rent. Emma had always been the kind of person who believed in small kindnesses. She had seen how much a little generosity could mean when her own mother struggled to keep food on the table after her father had passed away. A neighbor had once left a basket of groceries at their door without saying a word. Emma never forgot that. A few days passed, and Emma had nearly forgotten about the incident at the cafe, until something unusual happened. She found a letter in her mailbox. At first, she assumed it was another bill or an advertisement. But when she opened it, the paper inside was carefully folded, and the handwriting was neat, almost elegant. Asterisk, dear miss, you may not remember me, but I remember you. A few days ago, in a small cafe, you did something that many might overlook. You paid for a stranger's coffee. To you, it might have seemed like nothing, but to me, it was everything. I want you to know that kindness is never forgotten. Sometimes, it returns in ways you least expect. Keep believing in good things. They will find their way back to you. With gratitude, a friend asterisk. Emma reread the letter, her heart pounding. Who had sent this? The only person she had helped recently was the old man at the cafe. Could it have been him? A strange sense of curiosity washed over her. There was no return address, no name other than a friend. It was mysterious yet heartfelt. Emma held onto the letter, a mixture of emotions swirling inside her. It was just a coffee, just a small act. And yet, somehow, it had left a mark on someone. She had no idea that this letter was only the beginning. Emma couldn't shake off the feeling of intrigue that the letter had sparked in her. The words lingered in her mind. Kindness is never forgotten. Who was this mysterious friend? She decided to visit the cafe again, hoping to find the old man. Maybe he'd be sitting in his usual corner, sipping his coffee. Maybe she could ask him if he had written the letter. The next morning, Emma arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. The familiar scent of coffee beans and freshly baked pastries greeted her as she stepped inside. Her eyes scanned the tables, searching for the old man. But he wasn't there. Disappointed but not discouraged, she approached the barista, a friendly young woman named Mia, who had worked there for years. "Hey, do you remember that elderly man from a few days ago? The one who was counting his change?" Emma asked. Mia furrowed her brows, thinking, "Oh, yeah, I remember him. He comes in every now and then, but not on a regular schedule." "Why?" Emma hesitated, unsure how much she should reveal. I got this letter, and I think it might be from him." Mia's eyes lit up with curiosity. "That's interesting. I don't know much about him, but I do know he always sits by the window when he's here. He seems like a quiet, thoughtful guy." Emma glanced toward the window, picturing him sitting there with his coffee, staring out at the busy street. She sighed. "Do you know his name?" Mia shook her head. "Sorry, he never really talks much. But maybe he'll come back soon." Emma nodded and thanked her before heading out. She decided she'd keep an eye out for him. Days passed. She checked the cafe every morning before work, but the old man never showed up. Part of her felt silly for being so invested in a simple letter, but another part of her couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to the story. Then, one evening, just as she was about to give up on the whole thing, she found another letter. This time, it was slipped under her apartment door. Her breath caught as she picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. Asterisk, "Dear Miss, I see that you have been looking for me. That means your heart is as kind as I believed it to be. But there is something you must know. This is not just about a cup of coffee. I have something important to tell you. Come to the park bench near the old library at 5 p.m. tomorrow. I will be waiting. Yours sincerely, a friend." Asterisk. Emma's heart pounded. This was turning into something far more mysterious than she had imagined. Who was this man? And what could be so important that he needed to meet her in person? She wasn't sure whether to be nervous or excited. But one thing was certain. She had to go. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma made her way to the old library. The park bench stood beneath a large oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. And there he was. The old man sat quietly, his hands resting on his lap, his gaze fixed on the sky as if lost in thought. Taking a deep breath, Emma approached him. "You came," he said, his voice warm but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "I had to," she replied, holding up the letter. "You wrote this, didn't you?" The old man nodded. "Yes, and I have a story to tell you." Emma sat beside him, her heart racing. She had no idea that what he was about to reveal would change her life forever. The evening air carried a slight chill, but Emma barely noticed. She sat on the park bench beside the old man, her curiosity mounting. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old, folded photograph. "This was taken many years ago," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia as he handed it to her. Emma studied the photo. It was faded and creased, but she could still make out the image. A young couple standing in front of a bookstore, smiling at the camera. The man looked familiar, though much younger, and beside him stood a woman with kind eyes and an infectious smile. "That's you," Emma said, looking at the older man. He nodded. "And that's my wife, Margaret." His voice softened at her name. "We owned that bookstore once. It was our dream, our life." Emma's chest tightened. "What happened?" The old man exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. "We spent decades building our little shop. It was more than just a business. It was a place where stories came to life. We helped people find the right books at the right time, and in return, they brought us joy." He paused, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. "But life is unpredictable. Margaret fell ill. At first, we thought it was something minor, something we could manage. But it wasn't. Medical bills piled up, and we had no choice but to sell the bookstore to afford her treatments." Emma felt a pang of sadness. She had always loved bookstores, had always dreamed of owning one herself one day. To think that someone had built one from scratch, only to lose it, it was heartbreaking. "I stayed by her side until the very end," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "When she was gone, I was left with nothing. No store, no savings, no family." He turned to look at Emma, his eyes glistening. But then, something unexpected happened. Emma leaned in, hanging on to every word. "After Margaret passed, I found myself struggling, financially, emotionally. I wandered the city, lost in my grief. And then, one day, I walked into a small cafe." He smiled faintly. I was counting my last few coins, trying to see if I had enough for a cup of coffee. I didn't. I was about to walk away when someone stepped in and paid for it. Emma's breath caught in her throat. You, she whispered. The old man nodded. You. A lump formed in Emma's throat. She had never imagined that such a simple act could mean so much. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, he said. That kindness still exists in this world. That even when life takes everything from you, there are still people who care. Emma swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. But why the letters? Why all of this? The old man reached into his coat pocket once more and pulled out a small, aged key. He placed it gently into Emma's palm. Because I have something to give you, he said. Something that belongs to someone who truly deserves it. Emma stared at the key, confused. What is this for? He smiled. Go to 145 Willow Street tomorrow morning. You'll understand. Her mind swirled with questions, but the old man simply patted her hand and stood up. I believe in fate, Emma, he said, and I believe that bookstore was never meant to die. With that, he walked away, leaving Emma sitting on the bench, the key clutched tightly in her hands. She had no idea what awaited her at 145 Willow Street, but deep inside, she knew her life was about to change forever. The next morning, Emma stood in front of 145 Willow Street, clutching the old key in her hand. Her heart pounded with a mix of excitement and anxiety. The building in front of her was old but charming, with large windows that bore traces of dust and time. Above the entrance, a faded wooden sign read, Margaret's book. Emma's breath hitched. Margaret, the old man's late wife. With slightly trembling hands, she fit the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space lined with towering wooden bookshelves, still filled with books. Dust coated the surfaces, but the place felt frozen in time, as if waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. She stepped inside, running her fingers along the spines of books that had likely gone untouched for years. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the shop. There was an undeniable warmth in the air, a feeling of nostalgia and history. Emma barely noticed when the old man stepped in behind her. This is your bookstore, she said in awe. He smiled softly. It was. But now it's yours. Emma spun around. What? He chuckled at her shock. I've been searching for someone who could give this place the love it deserves. Someone who understands the magic of books, just as Margaret and I did. And after you paid for my coffee that day, I started watching you. Not in a creepy way, he added with a laugh. But I wanted to know who you were. I saw the way you helped others, the way you worked so hard despite your struggles. And I knew. Emma's heart pounded. But why me? I don't have the money to run a bookstore. I don't even know where to begin. You have something far more important, he said. Passion, kindness, a love for books that can't be bought. He gestured around. This store doesn't need millions to thrive. It needs someone who believes in it. Emma felt overwhelmed. It was a dream come true, but she had doubts. Could she really do this? What if she failed? Sensing her hesitation, the old man smiled. I'm not just handing you the keys and walking away. I'll be here. I'll guide you. Together, we'll bring this place back to life. A lump formed in Emma's throat. I don't know what to say. Say yes, he said simply. Emma looked around the store again. She pictured the shelves clean and full, the air filled with the scent of fresh coffee and paper. She imagined customers browsing, children sitting on the floor with open books, people discovering stories that would change their lives, just as this moment was changing hers. She turned to the old man, her eyes shining with tears. Yes. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for Emma. She poured her heart and soul into restoring Margaret's books, scrubbing the dusty shelves, organizing the books, and setting up a small reading corner by the window. The old man, whose name she finally learned was Henry, was by her side every step of the way. True to his word, he guided her through everything. He taught her how to run a bookstore, how to organize book readings, and even how to connect with local authors to bring in new titles. Emma had never worked so hard in her life, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a job. It felt like home. Despite her passion, challenges arose. Money was tight, and attracting customers to a bookstore in an age of digital entertainment wasn't easy. There were days when Emma wondered if she had made the right decision, but every time doubt crept in, Henry reminded her of why they were doing this. And then, the community started to notice. Word spread about the young woman who had revived a forgotten bookstore. Locals, curious about the place, started dropping in. Some just wanted to browse, but others lingered, reminiscing about the bookstore they had once loved. Emma listened to their stories, their memories of Margaret and Henry, and it only strengthened her resolve to make the store thrive. Then came the day of the grand reopening. Emma had spent weeks preparing for it. She had reached out to local writers, invited families for a special storytelling session, and even set up a small cafe corner where customers could enjoy coffee as they read. The morning of the event, Emma arrived early, unlocking the door with the same key Henry had given her. But when she stepped inside, she gasped. The once empty shelves were now filled to the brim with books, hundreds of them. Some were classics, others were brand new releases. There were books for every age, every genre. Emma turned to Henry, eyes wide. "How?" Henry chuckled. "I made some calls. Turns out, there are plenty of people who believe in what we're doing. They donated books to help us start fresh." Emma was speechless. She had never imagined such kindness. That afternoon, as customers filled the shop, laughter and conversation filling the air, Emma felt something she hadn't in a long time. Peace. This was where she was meant to be. As she stood at the counter, watching a young girl excitedly pick out her first book, Henry approached her. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and smiled. "You did it," he said. "No," Emma replied, smiling back. "We did it." Henry nodded. Margaret would be proud. Emma's heart swelled. That night, as she locked up the store, she looked at the sign above the entrance. Margaret's Books. It was more than just a bookstore. It was a second chance, for the shop, for Henry, and for herself. And to think, it had all started with a simple cup of coffee.